The morning of October 14th, Margaret Hayes stood in the kitchen of the home she had lived in for 27 years, and she did not cry. She was 55 years old, wearing the same soft blue cardigan she always reached for on cool mornings, holding a cup of coffee she had not yet touched. The kitchen smelled like it always did, cinnamon from the candle on the windowsill, a faint trace of the cedar wood floor polish she'd ordered in bulk from a shop in Vermont every single autumn. Everything looked the same, but nothing was the same, because standing across from her, on the other side of the marble island that Margaret had personally picked out from a granite showroom in Charlotte, North Carolina, 14 years ago, was a woman she had only ever seen once before, in a photograph she was never supposed to find. The woman's name was Dana Whitfield. She was 31 years old. She wore a rust-colored coat and carried a structured leather bag, and she placed that bag on Margaret's counter the way someone places a flag on conquered territory. "Margaret," Dana said, her voice measured, almost rehearsed. "I think you already know why I'm here. And if you're being honest with yourself, I think you know what the right thing to do is." Margaret did not blink. She did not shift her weight. She looked at Dana the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, with complete focus and zero panic. She reached out slowly and set her coffee mug down on the granite. And then, quietly, Margaret almost smiled. "I do know," she said. "That's exactly why I called my lawyer this morning, before you even knocked on that door." The silence that followed was the kind that changes a room permanently. Dana's composure flickered, just for a second, just enough, and that flicker told Margaret everything she needed to confirm. She was right. She had been right for weeks. And now, finally, the clock had started. Dear friend, welcome to this channel. If this is your first time here, I want you to know that every story we tell here is for people who understand that life is complicated, love is sometimes a battlefield, and dignity, real, quiet dignity, is the most powerful weapon a person can carry. If this story moves you, please subscribe, hit that notification bell, drop a like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's build this community together. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Margaret Hayes was not the kind of woman people described first when they walked into a room. That was always Clifton. Clifton Hayes, 58 years old, 6 feet tall, with silver hair he kept neatly trimmed and a handshake that made business partners feel immediately at ease. He was the kind of man who got upgraded at airports without asking. He was charming in that specific way where you trusted him before you decided to. He ran a mid-sized commercial real estate firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and over the course of 28 years of marriage, he had built it from a two-man operation working out of a rented office above a dry cleaning shop into a firm with 11 full-time employees, a portfolio of properties across 3 states, and a reputation in the business community that preceded him into every room. Margaret knew all of this because she had built it with him, not in the way that appears on business cards, in the way that actually matters. She had managed the books in the early years when they couldn't afford an accountant. She had taken the kids to school every morning while Clifton flew to meet investors. She had hosted dinner parties for clients in this very kitchen, cooking from scratch, remembering every spouse's name, every child's age, every dietary restriction, making Clifton look like the kind of man who had it all together because, behind him, Margaret actually had it all together. But people rarely see the scaffolding. They only see the building. For most of their marriage, Margaret told herself that was fine. She was not a woman who needed to be seen. She found meaning in the quiet construction of a good life. Their home in the Dilworth neighborhood, the oak trees in the backyard that her daughter Nora used to climb, the way Sunday mornings felt slow and full and safe. She loved Clifton in the way long marriages produce, not with the sharp urgency of early love, but with the steady, almost cellular certainty of someone who has shared a life. She trusted him, and trust, as Margaret would come to understand, is the most dangerous thing you can give someone who has already decided to use it against you. The cracks were small at first. She had noticed them the way you notice a faint smell in a house. Present, vaguely wrong, easy to explain away. Clifton began staying late at the office 4 nights a week. His phone, which had always been left casually on the kitchen counter, was now always face down, always with him, always locked with a new code he hadn't mentioned changing. He started taking calls in the garage. Small things. The kind of things a reasonable person could reason away. She told herself he was under pressure. The market was shifting. He had a difficult client. She told herself a lot of things. It was a Tuesday in early September when everything changed. Not dramatically. That is not how these things happen in real life. It was ordinary and accidental and devastating in the way that only ordinary accidents can be. Clifton had left his laptop on the kitchen table, open, while he went upstairs to shower. Margaret needed to check a shared account for a bill payment. She sat down at the table, moved the mouse to wake the screen, and there it was. Not hidden, not encrypted, just open, the way people leave things open when they believe they are alone and safe. A message thread. The name at the top, Dana. And Margaret sat very still in that kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and cedar, and she read. She did not read all of it. She didn't need to. What she read in those 4 minutes was enough to rearrange every assumption she had built her life on. The messages were not what she expected. It wasn't just an affair. She had, somewhere in the back of her mind, begun to suspect something like that. Some part of her already building a wall between suspicion and acknowledgement. What she had not suspected, what made her hands go completely still on the table, was the conversation she read between Clifton and Dana about the house. About her. About a plan. Dana had written, "The longer she stays in that house, the harder this gets. You need to move this forward." And Clifton had written back, "I'm working on it. I just need to find the right moment." The lawyer said if we can establish that she's been emotionally unstable, it changes how the assets get split. Margaret read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then she closed the laptop exactly the way she found it, stood up, walked to the sink, and turned on the cold water. She let it run over her wrists for a moment. It was something she had done since she was a girl, when she needed to think clearly. The cold water always helped her think clearly. She turned off the tap, dried her hands, and she made a decision in that moment that would determine everything that followed. She would not react. She would prepare. The first call she made was not to her sister, though her sister was her closest friend. It was not to her son Ethan, who lived in Raleigh and would have driven down that night if she'd asked. The first call she made was to Carol Simmons, a family law attorney whose card she had kept in the back of her address book for 7 years. Given to her by a friend who had gone through a difficult divorce and said, "You'll probably never need this, but keep it anyway." People give advice like that sometimes, not knowing how precisely true it will turn out to be. Carol answered on the second ring. Margaret said, "I need to meet with you as soon as possible. Not tomorrow. Today if you can." They met at a coffee shop near the firm's office on South Boulevard at 4 that afternoon. Margaret brought nothing with her. She just sat across from Carol, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she told her everything. Calmly, without crying. When she finished, Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When you went back to the laptop, you closed it exactly the way it was?" Margaret said yes. Carol nodded. "Good. That's very good. Now here's what we're going to do." What happened over the next 31 days was not dramatic in the way movies make these things look. It was quiet, deliberate, almost administrative. Carol filed a discreet request through a forensic financial consultant to examine a set of accounts associated with the Hayes Family Trust and several of the business's holding entities. Margaret had always been listed as a co-signatory on their joint accounts, but Clifton had, over the past 3 years, moved significant portions of the business's liquid assets into subsidiary accounts she was not listed on, accounts tied to LLCs she had no knowledge of. One of those LLCs, Margaret discovered through the Financial Review, had been registered 18 months ago in Delaware under a name she had never heard. The address listed on the registration was a property Clifton had told her was a commercial investment. It was not a commercial investment. Carol laid out the documents on her office table one evening, and Margaret sat and read through everything carefully, wearing her reading glasses, making small notes in the margins with a pencil. When she was finished, she looked up and said, "How long has he been doing this?" Carol said, "Based on the transfer patterns, we think it started approximately 3 years ago." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's when he started locking his phone." Carol said nothing. Sometimes there's nothing useful to say. There was one more piece. The house. The home in Dilworth that Margaret had lived in for 27 years was titled jointly, as it had always been. But Margaret discovered through Carol that Clifton had, 8 months earlier, consulted with a different attorney about a mechanism that would allow him to claim primary ownership based on a clause in the original mortgage agreement from 1998, a clause tied to financial contribution that, if interpreted in a specific way, could be used to argue that Clifton's name carried the primary weight. It was not a sure strategy. Any competent family court judge would likely reject it. But it was a strategy. And the fact that he had a strategy, that he had been sitting across from her at breakfast every morning while quietly engineering the architecture of her removal from her own life, was the part that Margaret had to breathe through, slowly, the way you breathe through something that is almost too large to hold inside your body. She did not let him see any of it. That was the hardest part, and it was also the part that mattered most. She cooked dinner. She asked about his day. She laughed at the right moments and was quiet at the right moments. She watched him with the careful, neutral attention of someone who already knows the ending of the story and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. What she didn't know, and this is what matters, was that Dana had grown impatient. Dana was not a patient woman. That was the variable Clifton had failed to account for. He had built his plan around his own timeline, his own controlled pace, and he had not adequately communicated that timeline to Dana. And Dana, who had been told that things were moving forward for the better part of a year, had decided to move them forward herself. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words, "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly locked into this story, because what happens next, I promise you, you did not see coming. It was a Saturday morning. Clifton had told Margaret he was playing golf. He did sometimes play golf, so this was believable, which is how lies sustain themselves. They dress in the clothes of habits. Margaret was in the living room going through some paperwork, real paperwork, documents Carol had asked her to review, when she heard a knock at the front door. Not the doorbell. A knock. Firm, deliberate, 3 times. She set down her papers, walked to the door, and opened it. And there stood Dana Whitfield in her rust-colored coat. Margaret recognized her immediately from the photograph she had seen on the laptop, though Dana was more polished in person, more composed, or trying to appear more composed than she actually was. Behind Dana, parked at the curb, was a dark green SUV. It was running. "Margaret," Dana said, and it was the first time anyone had said her name to her face with that particular combination of familiarity and coldness. "I think you already know why I'm here. And if you're being honest with yourself, I think you know what the right thing to do is." She paused. "Clifton needs you to make this easier. For everyone involved. The house is too complicated as it is, and there are arrangements being made that would be better for you financially if you cooperated now rather than later." She said all of this as if she were reading from a script, as if she had rehearsed it in the car on the way over, as if Margaret were simply a variable in a transaction that needed to be cleared. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Margaret had called Carol at 7:15 that morning, 2 hours before she knocked, because Carol had called her the night before to say the financial documentation was complete and certified and that they needed to decide on timing. Margaret had decided on timing. She looked at Dana standing on her porch, and she set her coffee down on the hall table just inside the door, and she said what she said. And the silence came, and the clock started. Here is what Dana did not know. Ethan was upstairs. Nora was in the kitchen. Margaret's two adult children had driven in the evening before under the pretense of a family dinner. A dinner Margaret had organized, calmly, deliberately, with a specific purpose. She had not told them everything the night before. She had told them that she needed them close this weekend, that there were things happening in the family that they needed to understand together as adults. Ethan was 31, an engineer, a careful and analytical young man who had always had his mother's patience and his father's focus, but used both with more integrity than either parent. Nora was 28, a graphic designer, quicker to emotion than her brother, but with a core of stubbornness that, when it mattered, had never once failed her. Both of them had kissed their mother hello the evening before and eaten her pasta at this table and watched her move around the kitchen with the same quiet certainty she always had, and neither of them had known that what their mother was doing was saying goodbye to one version of their family and preparing them, gently, for the truth. Nora came out of the kitchen at the sound of Margaret's voice at the door. Ethan came down the stairs. They both stopped when they saw the woman standing on the porch. Margaret turned to look at her children for just a moment, just long enough to see on their faces the beginning of the question they had not yet formed. And then she turned back to Dana and said, "Why don't you come inside? There are some things I think we should all hear together." Dana stepped inside the house. She looked at Ethan and Nora, and something shifted in her expression, a recalculation happening in real time. She had not planned for this. She had planned for a quiet, private removal. She had planned to apply pressure to a woman she believed would be alone, grieving, and easier to manage than she actually was. She had not planned for Margaret Hayes to be the calmest person in the room. Margaret walked to the living room, sat down in the armchair closest to the window, and on the coffee table in front of her was a manila folder that had been sitting there since before Dana knocked. She opened it. She looked at Dana and said, "Please sit down." Dana sat. Because sometimes, even when you think you have the power, the other person's certainty is gravity, and gravity always wins. What happened in the next 40 minutes in that living room on that Saturday in October was not a confrontation in the way confrontations usually go. There was no screaming. There was no drama. What there was, instead, was information. Margaret, in the steady, unhurried voice of a woman who has spent 31 days preparing for exactly this moment, walked her children and Dana Whitfield through what she had found. She began with the laptop. She explained what she had seen, and she explained what she had done afterward. She explained the financial records, the LLCs, the Delaware registration, the subsidiary accounts, the asset transfers over 3 years, all of it documented, all of it certified, all of it laid out in a sequence so clear and so methodical that it left no room for alternative interpretation. She placed copies of the documents on the coffee table as she spoke, the way a professor lays out evidence for a class that is only now beginning to understand the lesson. She did not look at Dana while she spoke. She looked at Ethan. She looked at Nora. And she watched her children's faces go through the particular kind of grief that comes when a parent you love is revealed to be someone smaller than you believe them to be. Nora cried. Ethan did not, but his jaw tightened in a way that Margaret recognized. It was Clifton's jaw, the way it looked when he was holding something tightly inside. Dana said nothing. Dana sat with her leather bag in her lap and said nothing at all, because there was nothing available to say. Clifton arrived home from his golf game at 12:43. He walked in through the garage the way he always did, calling out, "I'm home," with the easy familiarity of a man who expects his house to welcome him. He walked into the living room and stopped completely. His eyes moved from Dana to Ethan to Nora to Margaret, and Margaret watched something she had never seen on Clifton's face before. True, undiluted fear. Not guilt. Not surprise, fear, because he understood, in that moment, that the arrangement he had spent 3 years constructing quietly around his family had just come apart in his own living room. He said, "Margaret," just her name, nothing else. And Margaret said, "Carol is expecting your attorney's call on Monday. I'd suggest you make sure he's prepared. She closed the folder. She stood up. She walked to the kitchen to put the kettle on, because she wanted tea, and because the conversation, as far as she was concerned, was finished. Clifton did not give up quietly. That would have been too simple, and Clifton Hayes was not a simple man. Over the following 3 weeks, through his attorney, a man named Bradley who specialized in high-asset divorce and who was known in Charlotte legal circles for his willingness to use aggressive strategy, Clifton attempted 4 distinct maneuvers. The first was a counterclaim that Margaret had contributed to the business in a limited personal capacity and was therefore not entitled to the percentage of the firm's valuation that Carol was seeking. Carol had anticipated this and responded with the bookkeeping records from the first 6 years of the business, records that were in Margaret's handwriting, detailing every transaction, every invoice, every payment, kept in the old physical ledgers she had stored in the attic in clearly labeled binders. The second maneuver was an attempt to reclassify the Delaware LLC as a personal business venture predating the marriage, which was structurally impossible given the registration date. Carol responded with the date stamp. Third, Bradley attempted to negotiate a private settlement figure that was significantly lower than what the forensic financial assessment indicated was equitable. Carol declined on Margaret's behalf without a counteroffer. Margaret had told her, "We are not negotiating downward. We are going to court if we have to." They did not have to. But before it resolved, Clifton did one more thing. The thing that Margaret had been partially expecting since the night she read the laptop. Through a declaration filed in family court, Clifton's attorney submitted a statement claiming that Margaret had been experiencing significant emotional instability over the past year, erratic behavior, memory lapses, disproportionate responses, and that this instability called into question her capacity to manage her share of any financial settlement. It was the clause she had heard him discuss in those messages. Establish emotional instability. Change the asset split. She had been waiting for it. When Carol called her to tell her Bradley had filed it, Margaret listened and then said, "Good. I was wondering when that would arrive." Carol paused and said, "You don't sound worried." Margaret said, "I'm not, because I kept records." And that was the thing he had missed. The thing that someone who believed he understood his wife completely had somehow failed to see. Margaret had kept a journal for 19 years. Not a personal diary, a practical log. She had started it on the advice of a therapist she'd seen briefly in 2006, when the early years of the business were stressful and she'd been struggling with anxiety. The therapist had said, "Keep a record of your days. Not your feelings, your days. What you did, who you spoke to, what decisions you made." It was a habit that had served no particular purpose for most of those 19 years. It had simply been a practice, a quiet, consistent habit. Until now. Because 19 years of daily entries, written in Margaret's clear, deliberate handwriting, documenting exactly what she had done, who she had spoken to, what meetings she had attended, what decisions she had made, both personally and for the household, was not the journal of a woman experiencing emotional instability. It was the journal of an exceptionally organized, thoughtful, and present person. Carol submitted 2 years of the journal as part of their evidentiary response to the instability claim. She also submitted statements from 3 neighbors, Margaret's physician, and the woman who ran the garden center where Margaret volunteered every spring. A woman named Helen who had known Margaret for 11 years and described her, in her written statement, as the most consistently rational and steady person I have ever known. Bradley's instability claim was dismissed by the judge at the preliminary hearing without further discussion. The settlement was reached in December, in a conference room in a law office on South Tryon Street in Uptown Charlotte. On a Thursday afternoon, when the light outside was going gray and the city felt as though it was holding its breath against the coming cold. Margaret sat on one side of the table with Carol and a financial consultant Carol had brought in. Clifton sat on the other side with Bradley, and he looked smaller than he had ever looked in Margaret's 28 years of knowing him. Not physically smaller. Smaller in the way that people become when the version of themselves they've been performing collapses and what's left underneath doesn't quite fill the space. The settlement gave Margaret the house. It gave her a 49% equity stake in the firm, to be managed as a silent financial interest with quarterly distributions. It gave her full access to the joint retirement accounts, which were substantial. It gave her the car, the furniture, the kitchen table, the oak trees, everything that had always been hers, made formally and legally hers. She signed her name on the final document with the same steady hand she always had, and Carol touched her arm briefly and smiled. Clifton said one thing as they were leaving. He was in the hallway putting on his coat, and she was waiting for the elevator, and he said, "I didn't think you'd do all of this." She looked at him. She said, "I know. That was the mistake." The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. She watched the doors close between them, and she thought about the kitchen and the cinnamon candle and the cedar floor and the way Sunday mornings used to feel. She did not cry. She was not numb. She felt something precise and honest. The particular ache of closing a chapter you once loved and recognizing that the closing of it was still better than staying inside a story that had quietly become a lie. She repainted the bedroom in January. A soft, warm white. Not the taupe she and Clifton had agreed on years ago, but the white she had always preferred and compromised away from. She replaced the curtains. She bought a new reading chair for the corner near the window that had always been empty, because Clifton said furniture near windows made the room feel crowded. And she had believed him for 20 years, and now she sat in that chair every morning with her coffee, which she always let herself actually drink now, and looked out at the oak trees in the backyard, still and bare in the winter cold. And she thought about what it meant to finally occupy a room without negotiating yourself down to fit inside it. Ethan called every Sunday. Nora came to visit in February, and they painted the kitchen together, a warm sage green that Margaret had torn out of a magazine 3 years ago and saved in the junk drawer near the stove without ever quite knowing why. Carol sent a brief text in the new year, checking in. "How are you settling?" Margaret wrote back, "Better than I've been in years. Thank you." She meant both sentences equally. There is something people say about women who go through what Margaret went through. They say things like, "She was so strong," or "I don't know how she held it together," as if the holding together is the remarkable part. But Margaret would tell you, if you asked her, and if she was in the right mood to answer honestly, that the strength was not the hard part. The hard part was the quiet Tuesday in September when she sat at the kitchen table and read those messages and understood that the man she had trusted with her entire adult life had been engineering her removal from it, while sitting beside her at dinner every night. The hard part was the decision she made in the next 60 seconds, to not react, to not collapse, to take all of that betrayal and compress it into something useful, something precise, something that would protect her future instead of simply expressing her pain. That is not a natural thing to do. It is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And the fact that she did it quietly and completely and without a single moment of public breakdown is not a story about strength in the dramatic sense. It is a story about a woman who understood, in the way that women who have spent their lives holding things together usually understand, that dignity is not something someone gives you. It is something you keep for yourself, even when everything else is being taken. And if you're still watching right now, here is what I want to leave you with. Margaret did not win because she was smarter than Clifton in the abstract. She won because she saw him clearly for what he had become, and she chose truth over pride, patience over panic, and preparation over reaction. She didn't destroy him. She simply refused to be destroyed by him. And that quiet refusal, made in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and cedar, with cold water running over her wrists, while she thought clearly about her next move, was the most powerful thing she ever did. Not the settlement, not the courtroom, not Dana leaving that house with nothing. The decision, made in silence, before anyone else knew the story had already changed. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know, or something you've lived through, or simply a truth you've always believed about quiet dignity, please leave a comment below and tell me. Share this video with someone who needs it today. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, subscribe now, because every story we tell here is told for the people who need to know they are not alone. Hit that like button, share this with someone you love, and check back, because the next story is already waiting, and I promise you, it is worth staying for.